FM.
Burby's 99.5 FM. Kaieteur Radio.
Guyana is now a full-fledged oil-producing nation. But how much do you know about this valuable yet finite resource? On our radio program, Guyana's Oil and You, we strike at the heart of every issue with informed views and credible data. The time is now for you to arm yourself with insightful knowledge on your oil wealth.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, Kiana Wilberg, Senior Journalist at Kaieteur News, and joining me for the first time is my colleague, Zena Henry. She's also a Senior Journalist at Kaieteur News. Zena, welcome to tonight's program, and thank you for participating tonight.
Thank you, Kiana. Thank you for having me. Good night, everyone.
Now, tonight we're going to discuss a very important topic, and that has to do with the pros and cons of a national oil company. To help us discuss this very important topic is no stranger to our program. He is the co-director of the energy program at America's Market Intelligence, Mr. Arthur Deacon. Mr. Deacon, welcome to the program, and thanks again, as usual, for being part of the program and helping to educate our citizens.
Thank you very much. Always happy to be here.
All right. Now, without further ado, I'll jump straight into my first question this evening. Now, with Guyana's oil and gas reserves at almost 11 billion barrels and the government poised to host the country's first bid round in the third quarter, there is an ongoing debate about whether the country should set up its own national oil company. The Vice President, Mr. Bar Jagdeo, said this option is under consideration with the use of a strategic partner from the Middle East. Mr. Deacon, I'm sure that you've heard the Vice President on this particular matter. Please tell us, what's your take on it?
Yeah, it's a very important question that I think has to be top of mind as we go forward with this tender. And from what we've studied, we're a market intelligence firm that helps energy companies and investors go into Latin America. What we've seen and what we've studied is that national oil companies in general bring much more drawbacks or negatives than benefits. And there's a variety of different reasons. It includes the fact that the government, through the national oil company, has to take on some additional risks that perhaps it wouldn't if they didn't have that national oil company. So from the studies we've done, we believe that it'd be much more beneficial, at least in the next year or so, to move forward with a completely free, open market tender for those blocks that haven't been tendered yet. We don't believe a national oil company would be beneficial at this point.
Okay, but Arthur, there are examples of countries that have been able to use a national oil company, such as China and Saudi Arabia, to actually claw back some value and benefits for its people, especially as it relates to participation rights. Don't you think that perhaps Guyana can utilize a similar model or think of a similar model that can, use this vehicle in its interests?
Yeah, so in terms of growing their economies, but they shouldn't be examples or they shouldn't be examples for Guyana to follow in terms of democracy, in terms of how they give back to their people, because those two countries operate. China is basically a communist dictatorship, while Saudi Arabia is a non-elected monarchy. So it's very different than what we see in Western economies, than what we see in Guyana, which is a democracy, right? So the ability to have a centralized control, which sometimes allows for greater effectiveness of resources, is something that is just not as realistic for a country, a democratic country like Guyana. That said, those two countries have done a very good job in terms of building the technical expertise to grow those national oil companies. So they have one of the best talent within those companies that's really allowed them to tap those resources that they have located in their geographies. But, in Guyana's case, we've seen, in the last couple of years that there's just not enough technical expertise yet. Doesn't mean that there won't be, to make up this national oil company. So what it will be essentially will be a foreign company, Middle Eastern company, operating this national oil company, with the government just getting some, profits from it. But there's no real roadmap, no real tangibility of having a significant participation of the Guyanese people in the short term. So I think that's also a point of concern that has to be raised.
Okay. Now, the Middle East is known for having a lot of experience, technical expertise, which you just mentioned there. Do you think that it's possible for Guyana to, you said it's not advisable for us to do this in the short term, get the best benefits in the short term. But what if we partner with this person and get the training that's necessary and eventually take over? Do you think there's something that's still worth having in such a case?
Yeah, so I'm thinking more in terms of the tenders for this third quarter. And if the tender would go on with a national oil company, what it would require would be, first, creating the structure around it, right? Creating the laws around it. Second, selecting the partner, and ensuring that there's the proper frameworks to ensure that Guyanese participation is a X amount of threshold, whatever it's decided. To get that done, that would take a long time, right? That would take at least, I think at the best possible scenario, a year to do it properly. If you want to tender these things by the third quarter, that just doesn't work with the timeline. And as we know, right now, Guyana is probably the hottest offshore opportunity for oil in the entire world. With Russia and the war in Ukraine, causing massive disruptions in supply chain and oil supply to Europe and Asia, it's a massive opportunity now for Guyana to, of course, not replace it completely, but take up some of that oil supply and start shipping it to Europe. The investor, momentum is going to slow down, and that's also going to be coupled with the energy transition, which is forcing funds and investors away from oil and gas. So I think that a delay right now to get this national oil company just doesn't make sense for the panorama that Guyana finds itself in. If we want to think about long-term, 5-10 years, I think first and foremost, we got to create the technical institutes and the training within the country, get those people trained, also have immigration laws that attract some diaspora as well. And then once we have that, then start thinking about creating this national oil company. But I think right now it would just be too premature and too hasty.
Indeed. Azina, is there anything you'd like to ask at this point?
Yeah, you mentioned about technical expertise and about a year it would take for Guyana to actually develop that capacity. What advice would you give the government with your experience, the direction and some of the examples that the government should be looking at right now when it comes to actually getting more from the oil rather than pursuing a national oil company? What are some of the examples they could look at and learn from?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's a good question. Rather than creating a national oil company, which would mean taking on new risks and costs, even if Guyana is not the lead operator, when you're creating a national oil company and you're part of it, 10%, 20%, 50%, doesn't matter, you take on new risks. And that's especially the case when the blocks are prospective. And that what prospective means when there's no data to prove that there are hydrocarbons in those blocks. And that's the case for these blocks that are going to be tendered. Of course, we've seen amazing results in the Starbeck block, 90% success rates versus 20 or 25% global success rates for offshore exploration in 2020. So a major difference. So it's promising, but there's no guarantee. So a simpler way to increase the government's profit and consequently increase the revenues that flow in towards the people, which is the most important, is to increase the royalties in future production sharing agreements. That's the most simple thing in terms of creating profit while avoiding taking on new risk.
As it relates to Guyana is considering a strategic partner. Can you give us any insight, if you have, as to what role this strategic partner plays and how will they be benefiting from this collaboration with the government, right? Because in some cases in Guyana, we've had partnerships and the country did not benefit the most. And given our strengths or lack thereof regarding our legislation and stuff, how do you see this strategic partner actually being beneficial to Guyana if we were to take on a national oil company with this strategic partner?
Yeah, for sure. So before diving into that, I think it's important to mention the companies that are the leading front runners to be the strategic partners. And from what I've heard and from what I've read, and through interviews with people on the ground, it seems to be three main players, right? So it's the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, it's Qatar Petroleum, and Saudi Aramco, the biggest oil company in the world, based in Saudi Arabia. It seems like Saudi Aramco has the lead in terms of being the preferred partner or the preferred strategic partner for this national oil company. And the reason why I say that is because they already have existing relationships with the government. They've already been chosen to market some of the oil lifts from last year and this year. So, and lastly, they also have the most amount of resources and technical expertise between those three. So Saudi Aramco is definitely the leading front runner. What would a strategic partner mean in terms of the most beneficial structure for Guyana? The way I see it would be a partnership in which Guyana puts zero to very little capital expenditures into the development and the exploration of the oil resources. So it'd be 95 to 100% of the resources would be put by the strategic partner. In the labor market that we see in Guyana right now, I would assume that 90% plus of the employees would also be from the strategic partner. I think as we see in the local content law, this would have to be a gradual sliding scale in which the amount of Guyanese people participating in the national oil company increases as time goes by. But I think most importantly is what I mentioned, very little capital expenditure put in by the Guyana government with Guyana to get 50% of the profits while putting 0% of the money, right? But Guyana has a bargaining tool, which is they have access, they have the rights to these blocks. So that is something they can use to their advantage, and they should, regardless if they use a strategic partner or if they decide to tender it in an open market process.
Thank you for those very really important questions there, Zena. And still on the topic of the national oil company, uh, Arthur, you know that there's a lot of interest from Suriname, where Guyana is concerned, and having the two share their knowledge and even perhaps build some sort of synergy, given Guyana's population size and the experience of Suriname. What would you say should we learn from Suriname in particular, which has been able to create a national oil company as well as a hydrocarbon institute? What important lesson do you think we ought to take from that? Because Suriname has been able to prepare itself for quite some time before hitting some of the discoveries that it is like Guyana.
Yeah, I mean, Suriname, it's a little bit of a different case for the people that don't know, because they've found oil multiple decades ago. It wasn't a large amount, but that's allowed them to create a national oil company over time. But more than taking lessons learned in terms of what to do, I think it shows what Guyana should not do. And, it might seem a bit harsh, but Staatsolie, which is a national oil company, I wouldn't say is a figure, a company to follow in terms of what Guyana wants to accomplish, because they've had a lot of history of nepotism, and issues there that it's I think could be avoided if you don't have a national oil company, if you have private operators developing those resources. Now, that's not to say that they might not turn things around and have a great future as investment comes in and they develop their technical resources. But I think more than anything, it should serve as a warning sign for Guyana.
So, in your view, Arthur, given the examples that we have with Petrotrin in Trinidad and Tobago, with Venezuela's national oil company, and with Suriname, the warning signs are just too many for us to head in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to generalize, because every country is different. But if we look at just data, we're a data heavy company, and we use data to base our conclusions. A study done, it wasn't done by us, but it's done by the National Resource Institute. It revealed that around 60% of national oil companies have either weak, poor, or failing performance when it comes to public transparency. So that's over 50%, and that's a very concerning figure. And when we look at the national oil companies in Latin America, we think about Petrobras in Brazil, we think about Pemex in Mexico, PDVSA, Ecopetrol. Those companies in general have all been involved in some sort of massive corruption scandal. Petrobras was basically the centerpiece behind one of the biggest corruption scandals, if not the biggest corruption scandal in Latin American history, Lava Jato, right? Pemex is the most indebted company in the entire world, oil company in the entire world, with over 100 billion in debt. And the government has to constantly dip into their public coffers to help them pay that debt. That's extremely concerning. PDVSA is, complete disaster. It had a lot of things going for it. Biggest oil reserves in the world in Venezuela, but Maduro and Chavez's just mismanagement and corruption caused a massive decline in production and investment there. Ecopetrol is a little bit different. I think they're a bit of a shining light in the region. They've diversified their business. They recently acquired ISA, a transmission company that has some renewable energy assets. So they're moving towards a greener type of oil company. And I think those kinds of companies are the ones that will do the best. Not only the national oil companies, but private oil companies too. But if we look at basically what I'm saying, if you look at the track record of Latin American national oil companies, it's very, very bad.
Thanks, Arthur. Now, there's only just one other issue I'd like to clarify, and before we head into the other issues, um, it is often said that a national oil company gives a country the opportunity to have a seat at the table to better understand costs and the complexities of the business in a way that you wouldn't if you're not part of it. Uh, is this a fact or is it a myth? Does it increase transparency? Does it increase accountability? Or does it do the opposite?
I think it does the opposite. I don't believe it increases transparency or accountability. What does increase knowledge and the country regarding their oil resources. I think that's something that the national oil commitment. But in terms of accountability and transparency, private companies, private, but I mean, I don't mean private, not in the public stock market, but private, not owned by governments. Those companies are way more open, way more transparent. They're required by their shareholders to be open like that by stock disclosures. So in terms of transparency and accountability, definitely don't see national oil companies as a solution. In terms of developing perhaps more technical expertise, they could, the country could benefit from that.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. Zeno?
I just wanted to ask, does it even make sense to pursue a national oil company for Guyana to pursue a national oil company, given that four countries have about 28 years left as the world moves closer to green energy. So we're transitioning. So we basically have about 28 years to develop and gain from our oil endowments. Does it even make sense to pursue a national oil company within that short space of time? Because we will very well see a transition.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the only way it would make sense to develop a national oil company, and it wouldn't be for the next year, I think would be in the next 3 or 4 years, is if this national oil company became a new type of oil company. And what I mean by that is an oil company that is looking beyond just oil, right? So it kind of goes against the name, but looking at gas, LNG, which is obviously going to be very important in Guyana, but also looking at diversifying beyond those and towards cleaner fuels, like biofuels, looking at, of course, non-conventional renewable energy, solar and wind, looking at developing the midstream and downstream infrastructure to get this energy, not dirty energy, but cleaner energy to consumers across the region, not just Guyana, because the region as a whole demands of energy. So the only way it would make sense, and this would be more for 2025, is to create a national oil company that is much more diversified beyond oil. That's the way I see the path forward for Guyana.
Thanks for that, Arthur. Now, on to just three other areas. We're about to head into a bid round later this year, according to the government. Arthur, do you get the sense that we have the prerequisites in place to select the right partner to be part of the offshore exploration and development that we have?
Sorry, I missed the first part. We're heading towards a what later this year?
We're heading to our first bid round.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. So I was wondering, given your experience in this area, do you get the sense that we have the prerequisites in place to select the right partner to develop our oil?
So I don't think Guyana is there yet, and it's an ongoing, continuous development process, right? And with first oil being discovered just 7 years ago, the speed in which Guyana has developed its oil has been impressive and unprecedented. So definitely credit should be given where it's due. But I think in terms of accountability of where these revenues are going and clear sense of where the revenues are going to be spent still needs to be decided on before we can move forward with a sustainable development of the oil industry. So I think that's something that still concerns me, and I hear from investors that we speak to consistently as well. The issue of transparency is the main concern before deciding to invest money into Guyana. So until that is improved, there may be a delay in much needed capital for the country's development.
Thanks, Arthur. And that leads me to my next question, which pertains to the use of the oil funds. Do you get the sense that it's being used in a manner to avoid the Dutch disease? Do you think we're on the right path?
So I commented on this a bit a couple of weeks ago, and it's still hard to know whether Guyana is going to be able to avoid the Dutch disease. It seems like it's putting in some of the right structures and focusing on diversifying its economy past just oil and gas. We see a focus on agriculture, on infrastructure non-related to oil and gas, bridges, roads, etc. So that's very promising. But the thing is, we still don't know how this money is going to impact the inflationary rate of the economy. We still don't know how much money is going to industries outside of oil and gas. We get figures every so often of private companies investing in so and so development, etc. But it's still not clear. It's still not clear whether enough diversification is being done in terms of capital and in terms of the essentially minimum thresholds that should be required by law to spend on different sectors outside of oil and gas. I still don't have clarity on that. So it's hard to know if it's going to be able to avoid the Dutch disease just yet.
Thanks, Arthur. Zeno, do you have a question?
Well, I wanted to ask as well. We have an issue with transparency here. It's not hiding. Do you think that Guyana should slow down its pace in developing its oil, because we have not yet developed the capacity to edit our expenses, to make sure we're getting what is due to us? But our vice president is saying we have a short window to develop our endowments, and we would like to do that and make sure that the benefits get to our people, but we do not have certain things in place. Do you think that Guyana is on the right track with its speed, or should we slow down, get our orders, get our business in order, and then consider our development? What do you think about that? We need to slow down or keep going?
A tough question. I think Guyana should keep going, and the reasons behind it really are based on where we are as a society now in terms of our energy needs. So, the EU is going to try to ban imports from Russia within the next 6 months, and that's a massive opportunity for other producers to fill in that gap. The Middle East, which is a major oil producer, is already struggling with current production targets that they have. And the US also has constraints in terms of production that's related to supply chain, it's related to labor costs, it's related to a couple of the bankruptcies caused by the last time they really ramped up investment in the shale production in the US. So there's a little bit of hesitancy there. So now, as I see it, is really the time for countries like Guyana, countries like Brazil, even to an extent, Colombia and Ecuador, to start filling in that gap that's being left behind by Russia. And that is combined with the fact that the energy transition, from what I've seeing and hearing, has accelerated intensively in the past 6 months. So even though Guyana might miss out on getting maybe 100% of what they would get if things slow down completely, they'll still get 90% of that. And I think when you look at long-term development of oil and gas, that 90% of the development that they're doing now is going to make up for what it would for the losses that would amount if they delayed this development, in terms of losing investor interest, in terms of the energy transition materializing even further. So it's really just an analysis of cost benefit. And these are just ballpark numbers. There's no study that we've done around it, but just from what I've seen and hearing, it seems like it makes more sense to keep developing as is than to slow down development.
We'll take a quick commercial break, and then we'll return to restart the program. Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen. If you're now joining us, this is this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. We started a very interesting conversation on the pros and cons of a national oil company, and helping us to do this are two very key individuals. We have with us the co-director of energy at America's Market Intelligence, Mr. Arthur Deacon, and my colleague, senior journalist at Kaieteur News, Ms. Zena Henry. And so far, we have covered quite a lot of ground as it relates to the pros and cons of a national oil company, as well as whether Guyana is on the right path to avoiding the perils of the Dutch disease. And we were just about to hear a very interesting commentary there from Mr. Deacon as it relates to what a civil society can do and what role it can play in terms of demanding more from our leaders. But we were plagued by some technical difficulties, and we do apologize for that. So without further ado, I'll ask my colleague to please repeat your question, and for Mr. Deacon to take the floor from there.
Right. So we were talking about getting society's involvement and civil society being able to access more information from the government, so that citizens could actually track, to understand and monitor the industry. That is currently an issue in our country. A lot of members of civil society organizations, they've been asking for more information. They want to be part of the discussion, want to be part of even the technical information and all that is coming out of the industry. So how do civil society get the government to let them in? What role do they play? How do they demand?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it really comes down to a couple of things. First is going out to vote and holding your politicians accountable. So not only your presidential elections, but also your municipal and regional elections as well. That's the best way to hold your politicians accountable and responsible for their actions and words. Outside of that, I still haven't seen any type of program or structure looking at the amount that's being spent by the National Resource Fund, detailed line by line. We know how much money is going to be spent this year. Basically, the entire revenues built out last year, but we don't know exactly where those funds are going, who are getting those funds. So that is extremely important for society to ask for. And then lastly, I think it's important to have some third-party independent task force or team made up of private sector, made up of maybe some government officials as well, but also some multilateral agencies, the IMF, the IDB, the World Bank, that whose sole responsibility is to make sure that the National Resource Fund is being spent transparently and that the funds are held accountable. Until there is something like that, I think that, we'll still lack the transparency that's needed. The current National Resource Fund, it has an accountability team, but it's made up mostly of members selected by the government, either directly or indirectly. So that's going against the purpose of accountability. So those are important things that civil society can ask for and should ask for moving forward.
One last question for me. Currently, we see our government is taking sums from the NRF and they're putting it into the consolidated fund for spending. They haven't specified how this money will be spent, but just saying that it will go towards projects within the budget and support these projects. Based on what you're saying with the clarity and having this third party person or group to monitor, is that current avenue being used by the government? Is that something that we should not be going towards, where we're taking money from the NRF to the consolidated fund to support projects? So in that way, we cannot see exactly how that money is spent. Is that something that the government should be doing?
No, from what I've read and seen, that is concerning, and that shouldn't be the case when it comes to spending the sovereign wealth funds or the NRF's funds. We see that happen a lot across different countries in the Middle East and different oil producing countries, where there's sort of a couple of steps, sort of shell companies that allow them to have more discretion in the way that they spend the capital. But that is concerning, and there should be, if it goes through a consolidated budget, it should be clearly defined where those funds are going towards and what they're being used for. If not, it opens room for discretionary spend that there's just no way to know where that money is going, and that's concerning.
Thank you.
Thanks for that contribution, Arthur. And to close our program, I know that you've been a very keen advocate and reader as it relates to the local content legislation. And I wanted your perspectives on, we've come a very far way from the preparation of that document, the passage of it, examining so many of its provisions. And now we have 4 sanctioned oil projects, which hold about 60 trillion Guyanese dollars worth of oil. Now, how do you think this document prepares us to lead 4 sanctioned projects of that magnitude, with 6 more in train to come?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of money and a lot of oil, as we know. And the local content law, I've always said that the way it was approved, it was a great improvement from the original bill. So that's a really good sign. And I commend both the government and the private sector for their work on that. What's a bit concerning is the local content secretariat. He has somewhat of a full discretionary power of approving or rejecting local content plans. And that kind of can be used as a bargaining tool, which is not very healthy. You can't have one person in charge of that. It should be a group or a team, at least, of independent officials. In terms of actually having the Guyanese people benefit from this oil and gas development, local content is probably just the preliminary step, right? You have the thresholds, you have the rules. Now, how do you put into action? And for it to be put into action, you need first enforcement, yes. And then 2, you need to be able to train people, the local people, to be able to take up those jobs. And a lot of those jobs, they are able to, but then there's some that there's just no local capacity at this point. And we've heard it from the government. We've heard it from investors that we speak to, that's probably the biggest challenge that Guyana currently faces is the lack of labor to sustain the rapid speed of development of the oil and gas industry. So, the rules are in place. Now it's putting into action. And the way you do that is by investing a lot of money on education, on training, and then also having the companies being held accountable for complying with those thresholds.
Thank you very much, Arthur. And with that, we've come to the close of our program. To our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for participating as usual. And we invite you to join us same time, same place next week. Zena, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you co-host with me. And to Arthur, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you for your contributions. And without further ado, I'll say good night to everyone. Do have a very safe evening. Thanks again, Arthur, and thank you, Zena.
Thank you.
Thank you.